You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 534 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, we spent most of the last episode setting the Atlanta campaign within the larger context of what was going on in the Civil War during the summer of 1864, especially in Virginia. Not just with the epic battles between Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, but also with Jubal Early's raid that threatened Washington.
And we also looked at what was going on politically in the North with regard to the upcoming 1864 presidential election. We said that through June and July, many in the Republican Party came to increasingly believe that Abraham Lincoln couldn't be reelected in November.
And so, as discontent grew within the Republican Party itself, as the Democrats watched from the wings, biding their time, and as Grant was stalemated at Petersburg, and the Lincoln administration was embarrassed by the scare that Jubal Early gave Washington, well, all of that meant the events taking place in Georgia that summer loomed ever larger in the public's eyes. And the fate of Atlanta became even more important to both the Union and the Confederacy, and of course to the participants themselves.
A graduate of New Orleans School of Medicine, George Petty was serving at a Confederate Army field hospital outside Atlanta when he wrote a letter to his wife, Kate, advising her what to do should federal troops approach their family home in Heard County, Georgia.
Honey, I scarcely know what to do about your leaving home. I do not know whether we will give up Atlanta or not, although I hope not without a fight. Your pa can do what he thinks best. I trust to his judgment. He must be sure not to let the enemy get a hold of him. The enemy are not interfering with ladies alone through the country they have passed, as letters received here from them to soldiers abundantly show.
I do not think they will get to our place. They may pass down the river on the other side if we hold Atlanta. If we don't, you may look out for a raid in our town someday. You must hide my uniforms in case you hear of them coming. You must not let any of the Negroes know where you put them. Your pa must send the Negro men away, for should the enemy come, they will have you robbed and whipped if they could.
If you stay at home, stay there. Don't run to the woods should the enemy come, but stay at the house. Never in my life did I want to see you so much as now. Every moment that I am away from you seems like years. Kiss Laura and the boy for Pappy. Give my love to all. Be sure to have the Negroes sent off. Be sure to have my clothes out of the way should the enemy get there. Do not put them in any trunk or anything about the house, for they will look in every box and trunk. Surgeon George W. Petty, 56th Georgia Infantry Regiment, Cummings Brigade, Army of Tennessee.
Louise Wigfall, daughter of Confederate Senator Louis T. Wigfall, and her sister were placed in the care of Joe Johnston's wife during the summer of 1862 when their parents were called away to Texas. 2 years later, they were driven from Atlanta by the Federals' imminent arrival, and Louise writes of the unforgettable trip to Macon they were forced to make.
Macon, July 11th, 1864. You see by the heading of my letter that already we have been forced to leave Atlanta. Not that it has fallen, but Mrs. Johnston received a letter from the general in which he advised her to send us off at once, and not to remain until the fate of the city was decided one way or the other.
I shall never forget the horrors of the journey from Atlanta to Macon. We left in a hospital train filled with wounded, sick, and dying soldiers in all imaginable stages of disease and suffering. My little sister and myself and one other lady were the only other passengers on the train, except the officer put in charge of us to see us safe to our journey's end.
I never imagined what a hideous, cruel thing war was until I was brought into direct contact with those poor victims of man's inhumanity to man. This was no hospital train with scientific arrangements for hygiene and the relief of suffering. There was scant supply of common comforts, not even medicine enough to check the ravages of disease, nor anodynes to ease their agonies, for the supply of medicines was daily diminishing, and they could not be replaced.
There was not even a place in that crowded car where the sick could lie down, but packed in as close as possible on the hard, uncomfortable seats, they made that journey, as best they might, in uncomfortable martyrdom. I reached Macon sick at heart over the suffering I had witnessed and was so powerless to ease. Louise Wigfall, daughter of Senator Lewis T. Wigfall.
You know, one of the things we like best about studying the Civil War is the wealth of first-person accounts that are available. It always helps bring history alive when we can listen to the voices of those who were there and hear in their own words their thoughts and feelings about what was happening and their description of events as they were unfolding in real time.
And what was unfolding in real time on the Confederate side was the receipt of orders from Richmond on the night of Sunday, July 17, 1864, directing Joe Johnston to turn over command of the Army of Tennessee to John B. Hood.
However, now that Hood had got what he'd schemed and maneuvered behind the scenes to obtain, he seemed strangely reluctant to seize the reins of command. He wrote later that the news from Richmond on the night of July 17th, quote, so astounded and overwhelmed him that he, quote, remained in deep thought throughout the night.
Before dawn on Monday, 2 members of Hood's staff helped their crippled commander to mount his horse and strapped him into the saddle. Then Hood rode to Johnston's headquarters northwest of Atlanta with an unusual request.
Right. Well, Hood said he wanted Johnston to retain command until the current crisis had passed. You see, it was just the day before, the 17th, that William Tecumseh Sherman had set his newest plan in motion, and so the Federal armies were marching from their Chattahoochee bridgeheads, starting an enormous wheeling maneuver designed to bear down on Atlanta from the north and east.
And so, with the Yankees on the move, Hood asked Johnston to, quote, pocket that dispatch, leave me in command of my corps, and you fight the battle for Atlanta.
But Joe Johnston refused to postpone the change of command. So did Jefferson Davis, despite a telegram from Hood and the Army's other 2 corps commanders urging him to delay the order, quote, until the fate of Atlanta is decided.
Johnston departed that afternoon bound for Macon, where he and his wife Lydia took up temporary residence. Before he left, though, the troops poured out their admiration for the jaunty little general who had restored their hope the previous winter at Dalton and who had retained their affectionate respect for him even in retreat.
Several of his old regiments marched out the Marietta Road that morning to take up new positions north of Atlanta near Peachtree Creek. When they reached the two-story White House that had served as Johnston's headquarters, the general stepped outside. Colonel James Nisbet of the 66th Georgia wrote, quote, "He stood with head uncovered. We lifted our hats. There was no cheering. We simply passed silently with heads uncovered. Some of the officers broke ranks and grasped his hand as the tears poured down their cheeks."
Although the troops, by and large, were sorry to see old Joe go, Hood's regret at Johnston's quick departure stemmed less from personal affection than from his reluctance to deal with the perilous situation facing the Army of Tennessee.
Although the 33-year-old Hood had distinguished himself as a division commander, he had been known as headstrong and rash, and he was untested in high command. In a telegram on July 16th, Robert E. Lee, Hood's old chief, after Jefferson Davis asked his opinion about replacing Joe Johnston, told the Confederate president, quote, "Hood is a bold fighter. I am doubtful as to other qualities necessary." Then, in a letter to his wife, Major General W.H.T. Walker, who commanded a division in Hardee's Corps, wrote, "Hood has gone up like a rocket. It is to be hoped he will not come down like a stick. He is brave, but whether he has the capacity to command armies, for it requires a high order of talent, time will show."
I wrote a little song to remind you, Choice Hotels get you more of the experiences you value. The Cambria Hotel's got it all. A rooftop bar, have a ball. Cocktails up here feel just right. Is Cambria amazing? All right. Bring a date, your team, or even your mom. Book direct at choicehotels.com. See you on the roof.
Still waiting in line? Again? That's time you'll never get back. Save time and money with Stamps.com. Over 4 million businesses have skipped the line with Stamps.com. Join them to save up to 90% off carrier rates from your computer or phone right now. Print postage for certified mail, registered mail, and packages in seconds. Then schedule a pickup right from your home or office. For a limited time, go to Stamps.com and use code PODCAST for a free welcome gift. Taxes and fees apply.
By Monday evening, word of Hood's elevation to command of the Army of Tennessee had made its way around the streets and to the remaining citizens of Atlanta.
That night, after practicing with the dwindling choir at Second Baptist Church, Samuel Richards recorded the news in his diary. Quote, "All of a sudden, General Johnston has been relieved of the command of the army, and General Hood, or Old Peg-Leg as the soldiers style him, is placed in command, so that there is thought to be a prospect for a fight before Atlanta is given up, as Hood is said to be a fighting man, even if he has only one leg."
One leg or not, John Bell Hood was one of the most complex and controversial Confederate generals in the Civil War. He was born in June 1831 in Owingsville, Kentucky. His father was a prosperous physician who at one time owned 30 slaves. His uncle was a U.S. congressman who obtained an appointment to West Point for Hood, despite the fact his father didn't like the idea of a military career for his son.
At West Point, as well as during his later Army years, Hood was known to friends as Sam, and as a cadet at West Point, Sam Hood struggled in almost every subject and was far from exemplary in his conduct. He was caught sneaking to Benny Haven's Tavern, a frequent sin among members of the Corps of Cadets, but was also cited for infractions ranging from possessing chewing tobacco and being late for chapel to, quote, "making unnecessary noise and dancing on the piazza," and, quote, "visiting the commandant with a cigar in his hat."
In September 1852, Robert E. Lee took over as commandant of West Point, and whether by cause or coincidence, Hood seemed to settle down. He accumulated not a single demerit in his last 5 months at the academy, ending up with a precarious total of 196, which was just 4 short of the amount mandated for expulsion.
Hood graduated from West Point in 1853, ranking 44th in a class of 52, which included Phil Sheridan, John Schofield, and James McPherson. Hood was commissioned as second lieutenant and assigned to the 4th Infantry Regiment in California, where in the autumn of 1855, in San Francisco, he had a passing encounter with a bank manager and former U.S. Army officer named William Tecumseh Sherman.
After an unremarkable 14-month stint with the 4th Infantry in California, Hood was reassigned to the 2nd U.S. Cavalry Regiment, an elite unit commanded by Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston, and whose second in command was Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee.
Besides Sidney Johnston and Lee, Hood also served with then-Majors William Hardee and George Thomas, who were among more than a dozen future Civil War generals who rode with the 2nd Cavalry. For the next 6 years, Hood soldiered with the famous cavalry unit on the Texas frontier, developing a special affection for the Lone Star State along the way.
Hood was wounded while commanding a detachment during an engagement with Comanches on the Devil's River in Texas in 1857, and was promoted to first lieutenant the following year.
In the spring of 1861, Hood resigned his U.S. Army commission and entered Confederate service as a lieutenant. With Kentucky reluctant to secede from the Union, Hood identified with his adopted state of Texas. In Virginia, after a brief stint as a cavalry officer, Hood, now a colonel, in the fall of 1861, took command of the 4th Texas Infantry. In March 1862, he was given a brigadier general's star, along with command of what came to be known as Hood's Texas Brigade.
Hood's record in Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia during 1862 and 63 was filled with hard-fought honors, including the Battle of Gaines' Mill outside Richmond during the 7 days, where his Texas Brigade lost nearly half its men as casualties, but played a central role in breaking the Union line.
At 2nd Manassas, he was in command of a division, and his men were in the forefront of the charge that overwhelmed the enemy position and swept the field for a smashing Confederate victory.
And then in September 1862, at Sharpsburg, or Antietam, his division's bloody fight in the Miller cornfield became the stuff of legend.
Promoted to Major General in October 1862, Hood led his division at the Battle of Fredericksburg that December. At Gettysburg in July 1863, on the momentous second day of the battle, he received a severe wound that left his left arm permanently disabled.
After an amazingly brief period of recovery, Hood rejoined his division and most of Longstreet's corps when it moved to Georgia in an effort to bolster Braxton Bragg's forces there.
Longstreet's force arrived just in time to take part in the Battle of Chickamauga, where on September 20th, 1863, Hood sustained a serious wound to his upper right thigh that necessitated the amputation of that leg, 4 inches below the hip. During the Civil War, the mortality rate for that procedure was over 80%. However, Hood not only beat the odds and survived, but incredibly recovered and returned to the Army to serve in the field.
Promoted to lieutenant general in February 1864, he was assigned to command a corps in the Army of Tennessee in Georgia, where, as y'all know, as spring turned to summer and as the Army retreated southward again and again, Hood's correspondence with his contacts in Richmond not only conveyed criticism of Joe Johnston's command decisions, but contained not-so-subtle hints that he could do a better job.
Jefferson Davis's decision to sack Joe Johnston and replace him with John B. Hood on July 17th was among the most controversial the Confederate president would make during the war. Ever afterward, Johnston, as well as his friends and allies, argued that his Fabian approach to the operations in Georgia had been the only realistic strategy for the rebels to follow.
A Fabian strategy avoids pitched battles in favor of wearing down an opponent, and as Johnston practiced it in Georgia, it involved steadily giving up ground while watching for an opportunity to possibly strike an offensive blow when the Yankees were at a disadvantage.
Exactly. Well, in any case, despite the passion with which Joe Johnston and others made their argument in support of his strategy, a calmer look at the matter makes it clear that if Atlanta had to be held, then Jefferson Davis was fully justified in removing Johnston from command of the Army of Tennessee. Indeed, he would have been justified in doing so much earlier than he did.
Davis's selection of Hood to replace Johnston is more questionable, but logical, considering the information he had, and was probably the best choice that Davis could have made given the circumstances.
Time and a sense of urgency dictated that the new commander had to come from within the Army and be familiar with the area in which the Army of Tennessee was then operating. Had Davis acted a week or two earlier, he could have sent someone from outside, although P.G.T. Beauregard was probably the only realistic choice. But for Jefferson Davis, who was not a fan of either Johnston or Beauregard, replacing one with the other would have seemed to be a lose-lose proposition anyway.
Within the Army, the only conceivable options were Hardee and Hood. Davis knew that Hardee had declined command of the Army the previous December, and at any rate, Davis had been told that Hardee supported Johnston's Fabian strategy, so that was another mark against him.
Hardee had also been a leader in the Army's old anti-Bragg faction, and so needless to say, his appointment wouldn't sit well with the Confederate president's chief military advisor in Richmond, one Braxton Bragg. And Hardee's elevation might well rekindle the destructive feuding within the Army between the pro- and anti-Bragg generals. Well, Jefferson Davis's real problem in July 1864 was the rot he had allowed to develop and fester in the Army of Tennessee's high command in 1862 and 63, and now it was simply too late to do anything about it, now that the situation in Georgia had reached a crisis point in the summer of 1864. And so, by the morning of July 18th, the die had been cast for the Confederacy. The fate of Atlanta would rest on the shoulders of John B. Hood.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is The Atlanta Campaign, 1864, Sherman's Campaign to the Outskirts of Atlanta by David A. Powell.
We've already recommended Powell's trilogy of books on the Atlanta Campaign, and those are in-depth, detailed treatments of the subject. But for those of you looking for something that's a bit lighter fare, Powell has also done a couple of books on the campaign for Casemate, which are fully illustrated narratives, complete with maps and photos and whatnot. The first of those books is The Atlanta Campaign, 1864, Sherman's Campaign to the Outskirts of Atlanta. And in this one, he also covers the change of command between Johnston and Hood.
As always, you can find a complete list of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info about joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and helping support the podcast in that way, just like Russ M. and Sarah did this past week.
A big thank you to them, and also to Anthony S. and Craig W. for their donations. Then thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. Rich and I do hope that you will join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.